The summary that was sent to lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Jerry Nadler called it a brief summary, and that it was, and he laid out the headlines. Julia Ainsley is with us. One thing I still have a question on, Julia, because we joined Pete slightly late, is whether Mueller found any evidence of conspiracy.
I'm glad you asked that, Katie, because I just got to a footnote. What he decided to investigate was coordinated. This would be conspiracy charges. He wanted to be able to define coordinated, whether or not the Trump campaign coordinated with Russian efforts. I'm going to read you what it says here in this footnote because it's key. It says, in assessing potential conspiracy charges, the special counsel also considered whether members of the campaign coordinated with Russian election interference activities. The special counsel, this is key, defined coordination as an agreement, tacit or express, between the Trump campaign and the Russian government on election interference. And in that case, they did not find that coordination. They said there are several attempts by the Russian government to try to reach out to the Trump campaign. But it says, despite multiple offers from Russian-affiliated individuals to assist the Trump campaign, the special counsel did not find that the Trump campaign or anyone associated with it conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in these efforts. So he's spelling out exactly what he is clearing them from. And he says tacitly or expressly they did not. That answers a big question because a lot of people thought perhaps there were signals. It wasn't expressed. But when the president, as a candidate, said, Russia, if you're listening, could that have been tacit? And Robert Mueller has weighed in and said that was not tacit. There was no coordination or conspiracy.
So this vindicates the president on collusion.
It does. So it would vindicate him on collusion. Now, you have to remember, collusion is a term that was laid out in the charge given to special counsel Robert Mueller when he got this assignment. But it's not a criminal charge. There's no statute on collusion. What you would have would be conspiracy or coordination. So that is what Robert Mueller is answering here because he's sticking to the criminal statute. And he's been cleared. He's cleared the president and his campaign, anyone associated with it, on both of those things.
It's not just Russia, if you're listening, Julia. This also goes to the Trump Tower meeting. A lot of people out there believed and expressed this much, that Don Jr. even accepting dirt from a Russian national that was alleged to have come from the Russian government in an email was enough to say that there was conspiracy. Robert Mueller said, no, that was not enough.
That's right. We have been talking about that 2016 June Trump Tower meeting for a long time because he said in an email, the president's son, if you've got dirt, I would love to see this. And they had that meeting. Now, the line from the Trump campaign or the Trump White House about their campaign was that they didn't find anything material, that the lawyer who came didn't present them anything material. And apparently Robert Mueller has weighed in that same way. He said that, again, multiple efforts. You could think about Roger Stone meeting with WikiLeaks. You could think about Russian-affiliated people reaching out to meet with Roger Stone and his associates. Other people associated. Konstantin Kilimnik meeting with Paul Manafort when he was the chair of the campaign in the summer of 2016. Take all of those things together. Robert Mueller has decided that none of those meetings were tacit or express agreement to coordinate with the Russian government. So he's clearing them of that.
What we don't have,
Katie,
though,
I could go on.
No, what we don't have, though, is an answer, Julia, on all of the so-called smoke, all of the questions of why so many people within Donald Trump's orbit lied about their contacts with Russia and continued to do so, even to federal investigators.
And that's why there's more to come. If I'm looking here at the last page of this letter, the Attorney General lays out that based on his discussions with the special counsel, it's apparent that the report contains material that is or could be subject to a criminal procedure law that imposes restriction on the disclosure of information. But he's noting that some of this information may be in the public interest. Of course, we have a lot of questions that are not answered in this letter. All of this smoke, all of those signals that you lay out, Katie, they haven't been answered. And so I think that the Attorney General, and what I've heard from sources today, is that he wants to answer as many of these questions as he can in due time. But he answered the two big questions today, which were obstruction and collusion, of course, defining that as coordination or conspiracy. And but more to come.
Yeah. According to the letter, what we're hearing from Bill Barr is that they're going to go through all of the material in the Mueller report. They're going to identify what they cannot release. A lot of that grand jury jury testimony, which is secret and cannot be released, and then they will give as much as possible to the public. Is that going to be enough for Congress, or will they try to subpoena that grand jury material? I imagine they might try to subpoena that grand jury material, and I imagine we're going to hear from congressional leaders on that at any moment. The other big headline, Julia,
Katie,
go ahead.
Well, there's another piece of that's jumping out. I'm digesting this in real time here. But he's saying that he wants to identify information that could impact other ongoing matters, including those that the special counsel has referred to other offices. So it could be that some of that information is not just protected by executive privilege or by grand jury testimony privileges like you laid out, but because they could impact other investigations. We know that this special counsel spun off a lot of these investigations, while it might be Michael Cohen in the Southern District of New York, Roger Stone, who is still facing trial here in D.C. in November, and the Rick Gates sentencing. There are a number of things that will spin out that really connect back to this president, but William Barr might be constrained in what he can say if they implicate those matters.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.